Nobody warns you that the plane ticket home can be a receipt for your own disrespect. Mine was. My name is Maya Reynolds. I'm 31 years old, a brand strategist for a fintech startup in New York, and on the night my mom called, I believed, stupidly, that blood still meant safety. It was 2:47 a.m. My phone buzzed like an emergency. Her voice cracked through the speaker, breathless, trembling, talking about family, about Christmas, about how she needed me. She said the word please 3 times. That should have been my first warning. I landed 40 hours later with swollen ankles and a carry-on full of gifts I couldn't afford. The airport smelled like cinnamon pretzels and exhaustion. I rehearsed hugs in my head. I practiced forgiveness on the ride to her house in Orange County. I told myself people change. Families heal. This time would be different. That lie sat warm in my chest. The door opened. No hug. No smile. My mom's eyes flicked past my face to my suitcase. She said my name like it was an item on a checklist. Then she said it.
Calm.
Casual. Surgical. You'll stay with the kids. We're leaving tonight. The hallway filled with motion. My brother Kyle breezed by, laughing, car keys jingling. His wife waved, without slowing down. Their kids ran circles around my legs, sticky fingers grabbing my coat. Kyle grinned and said, "Perfect timing, right? You're so good with chaos." Everyone laughed. Except me. Hold on, before we get into the real stuff, I want to know, what are you doing at this exact moment while hearing my voice? Cooking? Scrolling? Lying awake like I was? Drop it in the comments.
Trust me, it matters.
I stood there, jet-lagged, invisible, realizing this wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a plan. A fully formed, prepaid plan that required my exhaustion and my silence. My mom kissed my cheek like a transaction. She said, "You work remote anyway." Another laugh. Another suitcase rolling past me. The door shut. The engine started. The house went quiet except for cartoons and my heartbeat. Here's the part that still burns. I didn't scream. I didn't chase them down the driveway. I smiled. I nodded. I told myself I could handle a few days. I told myself being useful was the same as being loved. That's how they get you. That's how revenge stories begin, not with rage, but with compliance. That first night, I slept on the couch between Lego bricks and crumbs. At 3:12 a.m., my phone lit up with a group photo. Beach sunset. Cocktails. My mom's caption read, "Family time." Something in me cracked clean down the middle. Not loud. Not dramatic. Precise. Like a switch flipping off. By morning, the kids were asking for breakfast, cartoons, rides, snacks, miracles. I moved through it like a ghost, answering emails with one hand, wiping spills with the other. Every task stacked the same question higher in my throat. How long had this been planned? And why did everyone assume I'd say yes? Then I found the envelope on the counter. My name on it. Inside was a typed schedule. Feeding times. Bedtimes. Emergency numbers. A list of rules. At the bottom, a handwritten note from my mom. Be responsible. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. That's when I stopped feeling hurt. Hurt is soft. Hurt asks for comfort. What I felt was clarity. Cold. Focused. Unavoidable. If they wanted a babysitter, I'd be perfect. If they wanted silence, I'd give them peace. And if they thought I flew across the country just to disappear, they were about to learn what happens when you mistake kindness for weakness. Because I wasn't trapped. I was positioned. And I had time. I stared at the schedule until the letters blurred, realizing the real trip wasn't the beach. It was me. They'd sent me back into the past, banking on guilt, habit, and my old reflex to fix things. Outside, a car door slammed somewhere down the street, and my heart jumped like it was them returning. It wasn't. They were already gone. That was the moment I made a quiet decision. I would follow every rule. I would be cheerful. I would document everything. And when they finally came back, sunburned and satisfied, they wouldn't recognize the woman waiting. Not because I changed overnight, but because I finally stopped shrinking. The clock ticked louder, counting consequences. The first morning alone with the kids was worse than I imagined. 2 boys, 7 and 5, and a girl who barely spoke unless she wanted something, each running in different directions, screeching, yelling, and demanding attention. It was chaos, but it wasn't unfair. It was calculated. My mom had set it up so I'd feel like a hostage in my own family home. The kitchen table was littered with cereal boxes, half-empty juice cups, and crumpled coloring sheets. The dog barked at me like I was an intruder. And I had to remember, smile, be cheerful, be responsible. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. I brewed coffee, my hands shaking slightly, not from exhaustion, but from the surge of quiet rage. My first thought, document everything. Every spilled drink, every forgotten snack, every sarcastic comment from my brother's text checking in with, "How's Aunt Maya? Hope she's surviving." Survival was not enough. Survival was the bait. Revenge was the plan. And I had time, plenty of it. The kids wanted pancakes. They wanted cartoons. They wanted me to build a fort in the living room that would inevitably collapse mid-afternoon. And through all of it, I smiled. I laughed at their jokes, exaggeratedly cheered when they scored imaginary goals in the living room soccer game, and praised them for tying their shoes, even if they tripped immediately afterward. I became the perfect babysitter. My mom's words echoed in my mind. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. I realized she meant, don't make this fun. Don't make this memorable. Don't make this unforgettable. But I already had other plans. I decided to set a subtle trap. It started with small changes, placing sticky notes in strange places, leaving mild hints of chaos where they'd least expect it. Their absence made me bold. Emails went unanswered for a few hours. Toys were arranged in inconvenient patterns. The dog's leash left in awkward spots. I watched, calm as a storm, how every small disruption rippled through the house. And the kids, surprisingly, started following my cues. They sensed the shift. I became both their caretaker and a silent force they didn't quite understand. By the second day, the beach photos started flowing in. My mom posting stories, Call tagging me in posts I didn't see until hours later. They were laughing, drinking, living as if I'd never existed. That's when it hit me. If they thought this was a vacation for them, they were wrong. They were in my theater now. Every message I saved, every detail I recorded, would later become a currency, evidence of what they tried to hide, and of the absolute absurdity of treating me like a background character in their holiday. Lunch was another battlefield. Chicken nuggets, juice, and a relentless barrage of questions about school, friends, and video games. I answered, of course, but I added small twists. Subtle contradictions in what I said, tiny instructions that made the kids think twice. It wasn't malicious yet, it was testing. I watched their reactions, noting how easily they adapted to the new rules I set, how quickly they fell into patterns I could manipulate. Even their laughter felt like a weapon I could wield. Mid-afternoon, exhaustion set in. I could feel my body quivering from adrenaline and lack of sleep. I sat down on the floor with the kids, drew a massive map for a scavenger hunt I'd invented, and let them run wild. I smiled through gritted teeth, imagining the chaos my mom would walk into when she returned. And yes, I was already planning the story I'd tell them. Not confrontational, but precise, surgical, unforgettable. It would sting without seeming vindictive. That's how revenge works. Not through shouting or punishment, but through revelation. The shock of seeing what they had underestimated all along. Then came the quiet moment, the kind that freezes your blood in your veins. My little niece, the silent one, sat next to me and whispered, "Aunt Maya, do you get to go back home soon?" Her voice trembled, innocent. My chest tightened. I realized revenge wasn't just about my mom and Kyle. It was about teaching everyone, including the kids, boundaries, consequences, and respect. If I failed here, if I let bitterness spill into anger, the story would be ruined. So I smiled, hugged her, and said, "I'm here for a while, but we're going to have fun together." And that's when I saw it, the perfect opening. The calendar on the fridge. My mom's handwriting, circled in red. Flight back. Sunday, 10 a.m. I counted. For days. 96 hours. Enough to make a quiet, meticulous plan. Enough to turn compliance into leverage. Every action from now until their return would be precise, deliberate, and untraceable until the moment I wanted them to feel the sting. I leaned back in the sofa, exhausted, watching cartoons loop endlessly while the kids raced around me. A thought crept into my mind, sharp, gleaming, impossible to ignore. They thought they were clever. They thought they could manipulate me with guilt. But guilt doesn't bind me. Knowledge does. Observation does. Patience does. The sun dipped low, and the living room filled with shadows. I realized revenge wasn't about chaos. It was about waiting, watching, and turning every little detail into a weapon they didn't see coming. And I had 96 hours. Enough time to craft something unforgettable. By bedtime, the house was quiet. I collapsed on the couch, legs sore, body trembling. And yet, a grin spread across my face. Not because I had power yet, but because I knew how the game would end. And they would never see it coming. The night hummed with anticipation, every tick of the clock a drumbeat for what was to come. I closed my eyes, thinking, this Christmas, they asked for me. They got me. But they have no idea what's waiting for them. The second morning hit like a punch. I woke to a living room littered with cereal bowls, half-dressed kids running circles, and the dog barking at shadows. By now, I wasn't just surviving, I was analyzing. Every movement, every glance, every tiny interaction became a note in a ledger I was building in my head. This wasn't chaos. This was intelligence gathering. If my mom and Kyle thought they were clever, I'd outsmart them at every turn. Breakfast was a battlefield. Pancakes turned into negotiations. Juice spilt like lava on the kitchen floor. I stayed calm, smiled, and cleaned up, all while taking mental notes. Kyle's kids were predictable. They relied on routine, but they thrived on attention. Their energy could be harnessed or disrupted, but subtly. I realized this was my first real advantage. While my mom and brother were sipping cocktails in the sun, I was quietly mapping the terrain. By mid-morning, I noticed the first cracks in my own armor. Exhaustion had a sneaky way of creeping in, clouding focus. But I reminded myself, patience is key. Revenge isn't about acting in the moment. It's about orchestrating every step. I started small, changing schedules slightly. Lunch moved 30 minutes earlier. Screen time was cut in half. Even these minor adjustments created tiny ripples of confusion, which I observed with detached satisfaction. Then came the first test. My niece, the quiet one, tugged my sleeve. "Aunt Maya, why isn't Mom here?" Her innocence hit me like a jolt. I had a choice: show my frustration or craft a lesson. I knelt down and whispered, "Sometimes adults forget how important little things are. But that's why I'm here, to make sure nothing falls apart." She nodded slowly, unaware that her words would later become part of the story I'd unfold for my mom. The day grew hotter, the living room brighter. The kids' laughter bounced off walls, but beneath it, I detected tension. They were trying to figure out this new dynamic. I could almost hear them thinking, "Aunt Maya isn't like before." That's when the idea struck me. If I could influence their perception now, I could shape the narrative they'd carry to my mom. Not through punishment, but through subtle dominance. So I started implementing rules. Nothing harsh, just shifts that made me the quiet authority. Shoes off at the door. Toys organized by color. Chores disguised as games. Every instruction came with praise. Every compliance reinforced with a reward. Within hours, the kids began following my lead willingly. They were learning boundaries. And I realized, with a sharp thrill, that I could control the environment completely while my mom and Kyle thought they were in charge from miles away. Lunch was the turning point. Chicken nuggets, juice, the usual chaos. But today, I introduced a small challenge, a scavenger hunt to clean up the house. Each child had to retrieve items, sort them, and place them neatly. They argued, negotiated, and strategized, but I stayed calm, guiding subtly. By the end, the living room was cleaner than it had ever been under my mom's direction. And I had proof. Photos, notes, timestamps. Everything meticulously documented for the moment they'd return, when I would reveal just how much they had underestimated me. By afternoon, the sun was blazing, streaming through windows like a spotlight on my silent victory. I watched the kids nap, exhausted from exertion and structured chaos. That's when the thought hit me. They were training me too. I learned their rhythms, habits, and weaknesses. The more I observed, the more control I felt. They believed they were dictating the story. In reality, I was rewriting it line by line, scene by scene. Evening came. I made dinner, navigated homework, bathed the kids, and read them stories. Each moment was a careful calculation. Actions and reactions recorded in my mind, in my phone, and in notebooks hidden under cushions. Revenge isn't just about a dramatic confrontation. It's about precision, patience, and timing. Every email, photo, chore, and tantrum became ammunition. As the night settled, I sat alone, sipping tea, exhausted but exhilarated. I imagined my mom and Kyle returning the next morning, confident and relaxed, expecting to find a perfectly normal house. They would find something else entirely. I would reveal the truth through evidence, behavior, and subtle transformation. Their laughter, their smug confidence, it would all turn to shock when they realized the Aunt Maya they thought they knew had been quietly orchestrating everything. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the exhaustion sink in. But even in that moment, my mind raced ahead. Plans for the next day unfolded like blueprints. I'd need to introduce small conflicts, test reactions, and manipulate events without ever being obvious. The goal wasn't cruelty. It was awareness. They needed to see that their manipulation had limits, that their attempt to control me had consequences they hadn't calculated. By bedtime, the house was quiet again. I lay on the couch, kids asleep in their rooms. The living room was spotless, evidence logged, every interaction documented. I realized something crucial. I was no longer reacting. I was in command. Every laugh, tantrum, and sigh had been transformed into data, strategies, and leverage. And deep down, I understood this was only the beginning. The moment they walked back through that door, everything would change. I would not just be the babysitter, they would finally see me, and the revenge, the one I had been patiently constructing, would be delivered with precision, inevitability, and a satisfaction they could never anticipate. The first real step had been taken.
Control was mine.
Patience was my weapon, and the countdown had begun. The third day began with a sound that didn't belong to the house. My phone vibrating. Not a text, not a photo, a call from my mom. I let it ring. Once.
Twice.
3 times. That pause alone felt like power. When I finally answered, I kept my voice light, almost cheerful. She asked how things were going. I said, "Great. Everything's under control." There was a hesitation on her end. Just a breath too long. She hadn't expected that. After the call ended, I stood in the kitchen staring at my reflection in the microwave door. I barely recognized myself. Not because I looked different, but because I felt solid, grounded. Like I wasn't floating around waiting for permission anymore. That was when I decided today wouldn't just be about control. Today would be about contrast. I wanted them to come back to a house that didn't match the story they told themselves while they were gone. The kids woke up hungry and loud. I moved fast. Breakfast became structured. Plates laid out evenly. Choices limited. They complained at first, of course. But then something interesting happened. They adapted. They always do. Adults forget that kids don't need chaos. They absorb it. When things are calm, they calm down too. By 9 a.m., the house was quieter than it had been all week. That's when I started phase 2. I introduced what I called the board. A simple whiteboard I found in the garage. On it, I wrote chores, points, and rewards. Nothing extreme, just enough to gamify responsibility. The kids leaned in curious, engaged, competing. Within an hour, toys were being put away without arguments. Shoes lined up by the door.
Dishes carried to the sink.
I didn't raise my voice once, and I documented everything. Photos, short videos, timestamps. I even recorded a few voice notes when no one was around, narrating what was happening like a quiet documentary. Not emotional, not angry, just factual, clinical. The kind of truth that's hard to argue with later. Midday brought another surprise. A text from Kyle. Mom says things seem quiet. You okay? I stared at the screen, thumb hovering. I replied with one sentence. All good. Kids are doing amazing. That was it. No emojis. No complaints. I could almost hear his confusion through the phone. He wanted chaos. He needed chaos to justify what they'd done. I was denying him that narrative. The kids started asking questions. Not about their parents. About me. Why do you live so far away? Why don't you have kids? Do you like your job? Each question landed differently than the last. I answered honestly but carefully. I didn't villainize their parents. I didn't play the victim. I just spoke about choices, about boundaries, about how adults sometimes forget to say thank you. I watched their faces change as they processed it all. Kids are perceptive. They sense imbalance long before adults admit it. That afternoon, something snapped quietly into place. I realized I wasn't just preparing revenge. I was preparing proof. Proof that I was capable. Proof that I wasn't irresponsible or dramatic or selfish like I'd been labeled for years. Proof that the version of me my family relied on, the convenient one, was outdated. As the sun dipped low, I made dinner from scratch. Nothing fancy,
but warm.
Intentional. The kids helped. They set the table. We ate together. No screens. No shouting. Laughter, real laughter, filled the room. And for just a second, I felt something dangerous.
Sadness.
For what could have been. For a family that might have worked if I hadn't always been the backup plan. But sadness doesn't erase clarity. After dinner, while the kids brushed their teeth, I checked the calendar again. 2 days left. 48 hours. That was when I noticed something new. A sticky note I hadn't seen before. In my mom's handwriting. Remind Maya to clean the guest room before we get back. I laughed. Out loud. Sharp and sudden. They still thought I was temporary. Still thought I'd reset the house to its old chaos before they returned. They were wrong. That night, I packed my suitcase. Not to leave yet, but to be ready. I folded my clothes slowly, deliberately. Each movement felt symbolic. I wasn't running. I was repositioning. I slept better than I had all week. Deep. Dreamless. Because I knew something they didn't. When they came back, they wouldn't just be stepping into a house that functioned without them. They'd be stepping into a reckoning they couldn't undo. And the scariest part? They were helping me build it without realizing it. The fourth day dawned with a strange stillness. The kind of quiet that makes you hyper-aware of every sound, every movement. I was up early, naturally. Coffee in hand, I surveyed the battlefield. The living room, pristine, organized, and eerily calm. The kids were still asleep. The house, for once, was mine. But I knew this calm was temporary. In exactly 24 hours, my mom and Kyle would waltz through the door, expecting laughter, chaos, and gratitude. Instead, they were going to get a lesson they'd never forget. I spent the morning implementing subtle, almost invisible changes. Toys were grouped by color and size, but not perfectly, just enough to create the illusion of natural order. The kids' snacks were prepped and labeled with tiny sticky notes, not because I wanted to control them, but because I wanted them to notice. To remember, everything I did was intentional. Every action, every placement, every interaction would later serve as proof that I had been orchestrating this house flawlessly in their absence. By 9 a.m., the kids woke. This time, I had prepared an elaborate breakfast game. Cereal portions divided precisely, plates matched with favorite cartoon characters, drinks measured to the milliliter. At first, they laughed, thinking it was silly. But then they realized they had to follow the rules if they wanted to win points. The game kept them entertained for nearly an hour. I took notes discreetly, every giggle, and every complaint logged like evidence for later. Emails from work began piling in. Normally, I'd feel stressed, juggling remote responsibilities and chaos at home. But today, it didn't faze me. I was in control. I managed conference calls while building Lego towers with one hand and stirring pancake batter with the other. My stress was converted into power. Power over my environment. Power over perception. Power over the story my family had thought they were writing. Around midday, Kyle called again. "How's everything going?" he asked, voice laced with feigned cheer. I paused before responding. "The house is perfect. The kids are thriving. You can relax." A long silence followed. I knew he expected complaints, disaster, chaos. I gave him calm. That alone unsettled him. Kyle wanted drama. I gave him competence. That was my first small victory. The afternoon was spent on what I called controlled creativity. The kids and I built a cardboard fort in the living room, organized a mini obstacle course in the backyard, and even planted small herbs on the patio. Everything was structured, purposeful. Every activity was recorded. Photos, notes, small observations. By the end of the day, the house was cleaner than it had ever been under my mother's supervision. And every child was engaged, respectful, and surprisingly obedient. During snack time, the quiet one, my niece, pulled me aside again. "Aunt Maya, will Mom and Dad be mad at us?" she whispered. I smiled, crouching to her level.
No, sweetheart.
But sometimes adults forget what's important. That's why we need to remind them gently. Her eyes widened, understanding more than I expected. I realized I was teaching the kids more than just order. I was teaching them observation, patience, and consequences. Lessons my mom had never realized I could impart. Evening arrived, and I began the final preparation for phase 2 of my plan. I organized the guest room, rearranged the living room furniture subtly, and left tiny hints of my presence, post-it notes, doodles, and evidence of my careful organization. This wasn't about chaos. It was about controlled revelation. They would walk into a house that functioned perfectly, but every detail would scream, "I've been here. I've been watching. I've been in control." Dinner was quiet, intentional, and efficient. No shouting. No mess. No forgotten dishes. I could feel the tension building even though they weren't here yet. I imagined their faces when they returned. The smugness fading, the confidence cracking, replaced by the realization that I had outmaneuvered them. Not with anger, not with confrontation, but with patience and meticulous execution. After the kids went to bed, I sat alone in the living room, reviewing my notes, checking photos, and planning the final moves. The countdown was now under 24 hours. The anticipation pulsed through me like electricity. Every detail mattered. Every moment was a setup. By the time they returned, the house, the kids, and even I would tell a story far more powerful than anything I could say aloud. And somewhere in that quiet night, I smiled, knowing the truth. They had underestimated me. My mom, who thought guilt and nostalgia would bend me. Kyle, who thought casual cruelty was harmless. They believed they controlled the narrative. But in reality, I had been scripting it the entire time. They had flown me home for the holidays thinking I would comply. But what they didn't know was that I had already taken the reins. This was no longer about babysitting. It was about precision, observation, and quiet revenge. And when they walked through that door tomorrow, they would finally see the consequences of underestimating me. The 5th day started with a familiar sound, the screech of a cereal box tearing open, the dog barking at shadows, and my phone vibrating with another text from Kyle. But today, I didn't flinch. I had a plan. The house had been transformed. The kids were surprisingly disciplined, and every detail had been meticulously documented. I had shifted from reactive chaos to deliberate control. The countdown was under 12 hours. By nightfall, everything would be positioned perfectly. Breakfast was a quiet operation, almost military in precision. Plates arranged, juice poured, cereal measured. The kids followed instructions with surprising compliance. Even the littlest, usually the wildest, lined up without complaint. I noticed something subtle but crucial. Their perception of me had changed. I wasn't just Aunt Maya anymore. I was authority. I was predictable. I was the rule. And I could see it in the way they deferred to me, the way their eyes searched for my approval before acting. Mid-morning, I decided to escalate the plan. I created a small daily log on the kitchen table. Each activity the kids completed earned points: chores, reading, tidying toys, even polite behavior. Rewards were minimal but motivating: a sticker, a small treat, or a tiny privilege. The children competed quietly, and I observed. Every interaction, every success, every minor failure was logged. I wasn't just keeping track of chores. I was creating an irrefutable record, proof that I had maintained order, efficiency, and control while my mom and Kyle were away. Around lunch, I received another call from Kyle. "How's everything going?" he asked. I answered calmly, precisely. "Perfect. The house has never run smoother." I could hear the tension in his voice, the flicker of doubt he tried to hide. That alone gave me a thrill. He had expected chaos. Instead, I delivered structure. I delivered efficiency. I delivered quiet mastery. And every word was deliberate. I wasn't angry. I wasn't pleading. I was poised. The afternoon brought the final test. I designed a mini scavenger hunt, assigning tasks to each child that required them to work together and follow detailed instructions. Each instruction subtly reinforced rules, boundaries, and observation. They argued at first naturally, but I didn't intervene aggressively. I guided subtly, letting their curiosity and competitive instincts lead them. By the end of the hunt, they were organized, cooperative, and surprisingly attentive. And every detail had been logged, every moment documented, for the ultimate reveal. By mid-afternoon, the reality of what I was creating hit me. I wasn't just orchestrating behavior. I was quietly rewriting family dynamics. Every task, every interaction, every carefully placed note and photo was a message for my mom and Kyle. They had thought guilt and nostalgia would bend me. They had assumed I would comply unquestioningly. But compliance alone wasn't enough. I needed evidence. I needed clarity. And most importantly, I needed anticipation. As the sun began to dip low, I started the final preparations for Phase 3, the reveal. I cleaned every room meticulously, ensuring every detail reflected order, but also subtle reminders of my presence. Sticky notes, tiny annotations, subtle changes in furniture arrangement. Nothing extreme, just enough to suggest that I had been observing, planning, and executing a strategy while they were gone. When they returned, the house would tell the story before a single word was spoken. Dinner was calm. The kids followed instructions for setting the table. Plates were arranged symmetrically, napkins folded, and utensils aligned. I cooked the meal with deliberate care, every movement precise. The children helped where they could, learning patience and order. It felt surreal. The very chaos my family had assumed would reign was replaced with meticulous organization, quiet cooperation, and subtle efficiency. And it was all a reflection of the power I had quietly accumulated. After dinner, I tucked the kids in and reviewed my plan for the final 12 hours. Notes, photos, small recordings, and careful observations formed a comprehensive narrative. Every detail mattered. Every small action would amplify the reveal when my mom and Kyle returned. I felt a strange mix of exhaustion and exhilaration. Exhaustion from constant activity, exhilaration from the knowledge that I had flipped the narrative completely. Finally, I sat alone in the living room, the house bathed in the golden light of sunset. The quiet hum of the day faded into evening stillness. I realized something important. Revenge doesn't require anger. It doesn't require confrontation. It requires patience, precision, and control. And I had all three. Tomorrow, they would return. They would expect chaos, drama, and compliance. Instead, they would find a house functioning better than it ever had under their supervision. They would find kids who had learned boundaries, routines, and observation. And most importantly, they would find me calm, composed, and in full command. The countdown was nearly over. The stage was set, and their shock would be inevitable, unforgettable, and completely deserved. The 6th day began with an almost imperceptible tension in the air. I woke before the kids, naturally alert, already running through the final steps of my plan in my head. Today was the last full day before my mom and Kyle returned. Every interaction, every chore, every note left strategically around the house was part of a carefully constructed mosaic, a story of control, competence, and quiet power that would hit them harder than any argument or confrontation could. Breakfast was precise. Eggs perfectly scrambled, toast golden brown, milk measured to the ounce. The kids ate without complaint, following the morning routine I had refined over days. Even the youngest, who usually whined about the temperature of her juice or the way her cereal was poured, complied without protest. Their behavior wasn't forced, it was conditioned, subtle, and entirely under my influence. And I documented everything. Photos, timestamps, short notes about their reactions. Every detail was ammunition for the reveal. Mid-morning, I decided to push the experiment further. I created a responsibility challenge for the kids. Each had a task, tidying their rooms, organizing toys, and assisting with laundry. Points were awarded for efficiency, accuracy, and creativity. Small rewards, a sticker, extra playtime, motivated them, but more importantly, the challenge reinforced that I was the orchestrator. By guiding them subtly and letting them take ownership of the tasks, I demonstrated control without overt authority. And the results were remarkable. The kids completed tasks faster, more thoughtfully, and even corrected each other when mistakes were made. Around noon, Kyle texted again. "All good?" he asked, in a tone that sounded slightly unsure this time. I replied, "Better than ever. You'd be proud." No emojis. No exclamations. Just calm, measured words. Silence followed. I could almost hear his mind racing. He wanted drama. He wanted complaints. I gave him perfection. That silence was sweeter than any confrontation. It meant I was winning, invisibly but undeniably. Lunch became an exercise in subtle disruption. I introduced minor hiccups in routine, slightly altered recipes, tiny rearrangements of toys, minor shifts in task order. The kids adapted seamlessly, learning flexibility while still following the rules. I recorded each response. Every adjustment they made, without complaint, became part of the narrative I would present to my mom and Kyle. Evidence of the order I had imposed and the respect I had earned. By mid-afternoon, I realized that the real power wasn't just in the children or the household. It was in perception. My mom and Kyle had built a narrative in their heads. Aunt Maya is obedient, helpless, without guidance, and easily manipulated. I had dismantled that entirely. The house ran smoother than it had under them. The kids were organized, disciplined, and responsive. And I had evidence. Every photo, every note, every observation was a silent proclamation of capability and patience. As the sun began to dip, I moved into final preparations. The guest room was spotless. Subtle notes, doodles, and careful reminders of my presence were left strategically around the house. Every drawer I had organized, every chore chart I had implemented, every recorded response from the kids, all of it was ready to deliver the silent message. You underestimated me. This wasn't about revenge and anger. It was revenge in clarity, in precision, in undeniable proof. Dinner was calm and intentional. The kids set the table, cooked under my guidance, and cleaned up without complaint. The house hummed with order. The chaos they had expected would greet them was gone. Instead, every detail reflected my control. My mom's sticky note about the guest room would be addressed. Every chore completed. Every expectation exceeded. I realized that revenge doesn't require yelling, confrontation, or punishment. It's about proving a point so irrefutably that your opponents are forced to acknowledge it. After bedtime, I reviewed my notes one last time. Photos lined up in chronological order. Observations documented. Every interaction cataloged. I imagined my mom's face when she walked through the door. Confident, relaxed, expecting compliance. Then the realization would hit. Every small detail, every chore, every organized corner of the house was evidence of my orchestration, my patience, my control. Kyle would see it too. The meticulous structure, the calm, the efficiency, and realized that his assumptions had been entirely wrong. Finally, I sat in the living room, exhausted but exhilarated. The house was quiet, the kids asleep, and the stage set for the ultimate reveal. The countdown was under 12 hours. Every moment of preparation, every observation, every controlled interaction had been leading to this. I wasn't just babysitting anymore. I had become the architect of order, the silent force shaping events, the quiet eye in the storm. And deep down, I understood something critical. They had brought me home expecting guilt and compliance. Instead, I had taken control, collected evidence, and built anticipation. When they walked through that door tomorrow, they wouldn't just find a functioning house. They would find a demonstration of patience, intelligence, and quiet authority. And that, I realized, was far more devastating than any confrontation. The night hummed quietly as I sipped tea, preparing mentally for tomorrow. Revenge isn't loud. It's deliberate, strategic, and precise. And after 5 days of preparation, I was ready. The final act was imminent, and they would have no choice but to witness the result. The morning of their return arrived with a strange mixture of anticipation and calm. I woke early, almost before the sun. The house bathed in a soft golden light that made every corner visible. Today wasn't just another day of control. It was the day of revelation. Every detail mattered. Breakfast, chores, notes, and even the smallest interactions with the kids. The house was a silent, living testimony of my quiet authority over the last 5 days. I brewed coffee, cleaned counters, and checked every room one last time. The kids were surprisingly calm. They followed instructions as if rehearsed. Shoes neatly aligned, beds made, toys organized. Their compliance wasn't obedience in the usual sense, it was understanding. They had seen a shift in me, an energy they didn't fully understand, and they had adapted. And in doing so, they became instruments in the story I was about to reveal. The first clue in the reveal was subtle. Breakfast was prepared flawlessly. Pancakes golden, eggs perfectly scrambled, juice poured precisely, cups aligned. The kids served themselves under my guidance, moving with surprising efficiency. Every movement, every detail, would later act as silent proof for my mom and Kyle that the household had not only survived without them, it had thrived under my direction. Around 9, I heard the distant sound of the driveway. My heart skipped. I told the kids to finish breakfast calmly. Act normal, I said under my breath. They nodded. They understood more than they let on. And then the car doors slammed. My mom, Kyle, and their friends were back. I heard laughter, chatting, a casual energy of vacation euphoria. They were confident. They expected chaos, complaints, maybe minor failures that would validate their decision to leave me behind. But nothing prepared them for the reality waiting inside. I greeted them with calm composure. A warm smile, polite words, casual gestures. Nothing betrayed the anticipation I felt inside. My mom's eyes flicked past me, taking in the perfectly organized kitchen. Kyle's eyebrows lifted at the sight of toys arranged neatly and kids sitting quietly at the table. They didn't say anything yet, just glanced at one another. That brief, silent exchange was priceless. I could almost hear their minds racing. Did she? The kids, who had been bouncing around unpredictably all week, sat patiently, waiting for their parents' instructions. They answered questions with clear, polite responses. They executed small tasks with efficiency and care, and every single movement reflected the invisible hand of control I had maintained over this household. My mother opened her mouth to comment, and then paused, noticing the subtle post-it notes I had left in strategic corners, reminders, chore schedules, small annotations documenting progress. Her smile faltered, just for a second. She hadn't expected this level of organization. She hadn't expected precision. Kyle stepped into the kitchen, scanning the room. The living room was immaculate. Chairs aligned, floor spotless. The dining table set perfectly. The scent of a home-cooked meal lingered in the air. And that's when I saw it, his eyes narrowing slightly, that flicker of unease. They had expected disruption. They had expected minor chaos. But instead, Everything was evidence of deliberate orchestration, careful observation, and quiet authority. I handed over the first document to my mom, a small binder I had prepared over the last 5 days. Photos, notes, and a daily log detailing tasks completed, minor challenges, and outcomes. Each entry precise, time-stamped, and factual. No emotional commentary, just the undeniable truth. My mom opened it slowly, her lips parting slightly as realization began to settle. Kyle hovered nearby, his confident demeanor faltering as he scanned the pages. And then I spoke, calmly, clearly, with precision. Everything in this house over the past 5 days has been organized and maintained under my direction. The kids followed rules, completed tasks, and adapted to challenges without complaint. All evidence is documented here. I let the words hang. Silence followed. It wasn't dramatic, not loud, but it carried the weight of undeniable truth. My mom looked at me, her face shifting between pride and disbelief. Kyle's jaw tightened. The vacation bliss they carried into this house evaporated in moments, replaced by realization. They had underestimated me. They had assumed guilt and obligation would bend me. Instead, my quiet orchestration had outmatched their expectations, and they had walked right into the evidence. The kids smiled, unaware of the full gravity of the situation. They had played their part without knowing it, reinforcing my authority and subtly underscoring my competence. And as I watched my mom and Kyle digest what had happened, I felt something I hadn't expected. Satisfaction. Not vengeance and anger, but in precision. Not retaliation, but revelation. The power of patience, planning, and control had worked. The room was quiet, the truth unmistakable. I had turned a week of imposed labor into a demonstration of calm authority, competence, and observation. They had brought me home thinking they controlled the narrative. Instead, I had rewritten it entirely. The aftermath of their arrival was electric with unspoken tension. My mom, usually quick to take charge, lingered in the kitchen, flipping through the binder I had prepared. Each page was a meticulous record of my 5 days alone with the kids. Photographs of tasks completed, notes on their behavior, detailed observations, and subtle reminders of my guidance. She paused at almost every entry, her expression shifting between surprise and disbelief. Kyle hovered behind her, pretending casual interest, but the tight set of his jaw and the slight twitch in his hand betrayed him. They had flown me home thinking I would comply. Instead, I had orchestrated a flawless, efficient household in their absence. The kids, seemingly oblivious to the tension, went about their day as if nothing had changed. But I noticed subtle glances from them, acknowledgments of the shift in dynamics. They had observed my authority over the past days and had internalized it. My niece, usually reserved, now took initiative, helping her brothers organize toys without my prompting. The boys, who previously bickered over trivial things, collaborated, resolving minor conflicts on their own. Every small action by the kids reinforced the narrative I had quietly created. The household was functioning perfectly under my control. Around mid-morning, my mom finally spoke, her voice calm but tinged with a sharp edge. "Maya, this is impressive." "I didn't expect," she trailed off, the words failing to fully capture her astonishment. Kyle, trying to regain composure, added, "Yeah, it looks like everything ran smoothly while we were gone." There was an underlying tension in his tone, a mixture of pride, relief, and embarrassment. They had assumed that leaving me in charge would result in chaos. Instead, it highlighted their misjudgment, their overconfidence, and their underestimation of me. I smiled, deliberately calm. Everything has been managed carefully. The kids followed instructions, chores were completed, and the house maintained at optimal order. All details are recorded here, I said, gesturing toward the binder. My tone was neutral, no anger, no confrontation, just clarity. That was the power of subtle revenge. It doesn't yell or lash out. It simply reveals the truth in a way that cannot be denied. The rest of the day unfolded almost ceremoniously. I guided the kids through meals, homework, and chores while my mom and Kyle observed silently. Every interaction, Every correction, every task executed smoothly became a living demonstration of my competence. My mother, usually impatient, hesitated before giving instructions, realizing that her previous assumptions about my abilities were incorrect. Kyle, ever the skeptic, found himself quietly taking notes in his mind, acknowledging my authority without openly admitting it. By mid-afternoon, a sense of clarity settled over me. I realized that revenge doesn't always need drama, confrontation, or spectacle. Sometimes, the most effective revenge is quiet, precise, and undeniable. It is patience, planning, and execution. Over the past 5 days, I had collected evidence, established control, and orchestrated a narrative that my family could not ignore. And now, in real time, they were seeing the consequences of underestimating me. As the day waned, I noticed subtle shifts in their behavior. My mom, previously confident, moved cautiously, checking details before assuming anything. Kyle, who had assumed he would take control immediately, deferred to me on minor household decisions. The kids responded seamlessly to my cues, further emphasizing the invisible authority I had established. It was a quiet but unmistakable shift in power dynamics. Dinner was calm and structured, executed with precision. The kids participated willingly, following instructions without prompting. My mother watched silently, occasionally nodding, as if confirming to herself that what she was witnessing was real. Kyle remained quiet, his posture tense, eyes flicking between me and the kids. The house, which had been a battleground of anticipation and preparation for me, now stood as a testament to patience, observation, and control. After dinner, as the kids prepared for bed, I reviewed my mental notes for the final step, reflection. My mom and Kyle had witnessed the culmination of my week-long orchestration. They had seen firsthand my ability to manage, guide, and influence their children without direct confrontation. They had seen the efficiency, order, and calm I had imposed, and they had silently acknowledged it, even if neither would admit it aloud. Finally, after the kids were asleep, I sat alone in the living room, reflecting on the week. Every plan, every note, every subtle instruction had contributed to this moment. The revenge wasn't in chaos or conflict, it was in mastery. It was in proving, beyond doubt, that their assumptions about me were wrong. It was in demonstrating patience, strategy, and execution. For the first time in years, I felt a profound sense of closure. They had underestimated me, and I had delivered a subtle, undeniable reckoning. Not through anger, but through quiet, deliberate precision. They had flown me home expecting compliance, but they found competence. They expected disruption, but they found order. And in that, the power dynamic had shifted irreversibly. The morning of the 7th day, the day my mom and Kyle had planned their triumphant return to normalcy, felt heavier than any day before. I woke early, the house silent except for the hum of the refrigerator and the faint creak of the floorboards. Today wasn't just another demonstration of control. Today was the final act, the reveal, the quiet reckoning. Everything I had orchestrated over the past 6 days, every chore, every observation, every subtle intervention, was about to come to fruition. Breakfast was prepared with deliberate care. Pancakes, eggs, and fresh fruit arranged symmetrically. Drinks poured to the perfect level. The kids moved through the routine with a sense of calm that almost startled me. They had internalized the structure I had imposed. They no longer tested boundaries. They maintained them. And the best part? Their obedience was voluntary. It wasn't fear or coercion. It was understanding, a silent nod to the authority I had cultivated without raising my voice once. The driveway sounded first around 9, then the engine of their car, a signal that the vacation euphoria they carried with them was about to meet reality. The kids stayed seated at the table, waiting patiently for my cue. I adjusted my posture, smiled calmly, and waited. The door opened, and in came the sound of voices, laughter, and confident assumptions. My mom's voice was light, teasing, as if she expected chaos to greet her. Kyle's smirk was already in place. They didn't notice the subtle tension, the invisible web of order I had spun over the house in their absence. I greeted them warmly, moving with calm composure. "Welcome home. I hope the trip was relaxing," I said. My tone was neutral but precise, carrying the weight of quiet authority. My mom's eyes flicked toward the kitchen. Everything immaculate, everything in its place. Kyle's gaze swept the living room. Chairs aligned, toys organized, the floor spotless. Their expectations of chaos and disorder began to crack. I could see it in the subtle hesitation in their movements, the way their steps slowed, their eyes scanning instead of confidently strolling. The kids, obedient and composed, served themselves breakfast without prompting. Every action reflected the quiet, deliberate control I had maintained over the past week. And then I presented the binder, my culmination of documentation, photos, and observations. My mother opened it slowly, scanning page after page, her face shifting between astonishment and disbelief. Kyle leaned in, flipping pages with forced casualness, but the tension in his jaw betrayed him. Every detail was recorded, every small success documented, every chore accounted for. There was no argument, no exaggeration, only irrefutable truth. Finally, I spoke.
Calmly. Clearly.
"Everything in this house, for the past 7 days, has been managed under my direction. The kids have followed routines, completed tasks, and responded to challenges efficiently. Every moment is recorded here for clarity." I paused, letting the weight of the statement settle. Silence followed. The kids looked at me with quiet pride, unaware of the larger dynamics they had helped shape. My mom and Kyle absorbed the impact slowly, like water filling a container. The realization was unavoidable. My mom looked up first. Her expression was complex, part pride, part shock, part recognition. "Maya, this is incredible," she stammered. Kyle's lips pressed into a thin line. He looked at me, and for the first time that week, he seemed genuinely unsettled. They had assumed compliance. They had expected me to feel guilty, to obey, to be overwhelmed. Instead, I had maintained control, executed a plan, and built evidence they couldn't ignore. The kids, meanwhile, continued their morning calmly, as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. But their behavior reinforced the message. I had been the force shaping the household, the guide teaching boundaries, patience, and responsibility. My silent orchestration was complete. The house ran flawlessly, the children behaved impeccably, and the evidence was undeniable. By mid-afternoon, the tension eased, replaced with acknowledgement. My mom began asking questions about the binder, genuinely interested, while Kyle remained quiet but attentive. I realized that true revenge is not about anger or confrontation. It's about precision, patience, and inevitability. Over the past week, I had crafted a narrative they couldn't argue with, and they had walked right into it. That evening, after the kids were in bed, I sat alone in the living room, reflecting on the past 7 days. I hadn't yelled. I hadn't punished. I hadn't caused chaos. My revenge had been deliberate, controlled, and silent, and it was far more effective than anything I could have imagined. I had proven my worth, maintained control, and subtly shifted the power dynamic, all without overt confrontation. As I sipped my tea, I thought, they had flown me home expecting compliance and guilt. Instead, they found confidence, precision, and quiet authority. The week had transformed me, not just in control of the household, but in understanding the power of patience, observation, and strategic execution. They would remember this Christmas, not for gifts or laughter, but for the quiet reckoning I had delivered with subtlety and precision. And that, I realized, was the ultimate satisfaction. So if you've ever been underestimated, ignored, or treated as the background in someone else's story, remember this. Revenge doesn't have to be loud. Sometimes it's the quiet, deliberate control, the patience, and the strategy that leaves the deepest mark. And in my case, it was unforgettable. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to Silent Revenge Lab for more intense, real-life revenge stories. And remember, sometimes the quietest actions speak the loudest.